Hello, Vlad with a new story from my channel, Amazing Story. Natalia felt like she was being carried along by a turbulent river somewhere upstream, where she was absolutely certain only peace and complete harmony awaited her, both with herself and with the outside world. She wanted to smile all the time, but some part of her relentlessly repeated, "This is wrong. It's not time yet." Quote. Natasha could hardly comprehend what was happening to her. The last thing she remembered was the tall white doors of the operating room, where she was wheeled down a long, cold corridor. Pashenka. Suddenly, memories flashed through her mind like a bright lightning bolt, and the young woman immediately understood who she was and where she was. Natalia was lying in the intensive care unit of the city maternity hospital. But she had no idea how much time had passed since she gave birth to her long-awaited son, Pavlik. She and her husband had been undergoing treatment for a very long time, trying to have at least one child. At one point, Natasha even despaired, but that's when the greatest miracle happened. She finally became pregnant. Everything seemed to be going well, but in the last trimester, serious heart problems developed. The doctor recommended a cesarean section, but she flatly refused. "No, doctor, I'm going to give birth naturally. And no matter what happens, I want my baby to be born naturally." But, in fact, this could be extremely dangerous not only for you, but for him as well, the doctor continued to insist. It's impossible to foresee the consequences of this decision now. Your heart may not be able to withstand such a strain. Quote. But Natalia was completely confident, which, as it soon turned out, was very much in vain. The birth was unusually difficult. Natasha lost a lot of blood, which required 2 transfusions. And now, with great difficulty, she finally came to. Due to weakness, she couldn't even open her eyes right away. Her eyelids fluttered slightly. And at that moment, the voices of 2 men who were in the room at the time reached her. She recognized one of them as Oleg, her husband. He was carefully explaining something to the doctor. Natasha had to focus with all her might to make out anything. When she finally did, she felt goosebumps run across her skin. "Are you sure nothing can be done?" her husband insisted. "Understand, I can hardly even imagine how much money that is, but I'm sure of one thing. If you agreed to help, I wouldn't hesitate. I gave you 30% of my entire inheritance. Just imagine how your life could change." Quote. There was a brief pause, after which the obstetrician firmly said, "Oleg Stanislavovich, don't get me wrong, but I'm not God. Your wife is in critical condition. The chances of her surviving are 50-50. Quote. So, what was I talking about? Her husband chimed in happily. And Natasha, even through the drug-induced haze, felt a surge of discomfort. You said yourself that you had to perform a serious intervention during the operation. You said she could remain in a vegetative state forever, and then I'll have to raise the child alone. Quote. Yes, but, the doctor began hesitantly. However, Oleg interrupted him excitedly. Quote. If the chances of her dying or becoming disabled are just as great as the chances of recovery, then why don't we tip the scales a little in favor of the first? Natasha instinctively clenched her fists under the blanket. What is he talking about? Her own voice screamed in her head. Does he want to get rid of me? You don't even understand what you're asking for, the obstetrician replied sharply. What you're proposing isn't just some kind of forgery. It's a real crime, and I have no intention of participating in it. Not because I don't need the money, but because my conscience and a peaceful life are more important to me. The doctor added dryly that the most he could help with was handling the paperwork, so that it would be easier for him to register his son in his name if Natalia suddenly didn't send him. And I ask you not to return to this topic again, the doctor said coldly. After which the door of the room creaked, and he left. Careful so that her husband wouldn't notice anything. Natalia slightly raised her eyelids so that she could see through her eyelashes what was happening next to her. She could only make out the lower half of her husband's body and his hands, furiously clenched into fists. Frightened, she feigned sleep again, after which she heard Oleg whisper, "I hope that when I come next time, they tell me about your death." And she heard the sound of his retreating footsteps. Everything inside her clenched with horror. It was even unclear how she managed not to scream after these words. She couldn't believe that this came from the man she'd been married to for almost 7 years, the one she'd always considered the most reliable and caring person in the world. No matter how hard she tried, Natalia couldn't pretend to be asleep for too long. Half an hour after her husband left, she finally felt safe and risked opening her eyes. At the same time, a young nurse was cleaning the room. While wringing a dirty mop into a bucket, the nurse noticed the patient blinking frequently. "Oh, you're awake," she said cheerfully, looking towards the door. "I'll tell the doctor now. Just go home here." "Wait, quote." Natalia stopped her with a hoarse voice after the operation. "What's your name?" The nurse looked at her with slight surprise. "Claudia. Well, you can just call me Clava. That's what everyone calls me." Natasha nodded slightly. "Clava, I have one big favor to ask of you." Quote. The woman caught her breath. It was hard for her to speak. "Please call my mother, Anastasia Sergeyevna, right now. The phone number is in the medical record. Trusted person. Ask her to come and pick me up." Quote. Claudia looked at the patient in amazement, and then, looking back, asked in confusion, "Wasn't that your husband who just left?" "I thought he would pick you up later." Quote. However, Natalia shook her head with all her might. "No, no, no," she croaked. "Only it's not that he's very busy right now and probably won't be able to." Claudia looked at her carefully, but shrugged, deciding against asking. Having promised to call her mother, the nurse left the room, just as the attending physician entered. "Oh, you're awake." Seeing his patient regain consciousness, Alexei Vadimovich spoke slowly. His confusion and tone made it clear he'd been discussing some devious plot with her husband. The woman nodded slowly and tried to sit up in bed to talk more comfortably. "Where is my son?" Natalia asked first. "What's wrong with him? How is he feeling?" Quote. The young mother's voice was filled with genuine concern. After all, she hadn't seen Pavlik since his birth. The doctor was secretly overjoyed and answered with a sincere smile, "Don't worry, your little boy is fine." Pavel Olegovich was born strong and healthy, weighing 3 kilos. Natalia sank back onto the pillow with relief. "When can I see him?" she asked. He probably needs feeding by now. And at that moment, a slight shadow crossed Alexei Vadimovich's face. I'm afraid we'll have to wait. You've lost a lot of blood and strength, and you don't have any milk right now. So, for now, just lie there. At least another week. We'll treat you, give you vitamins, a course of IVs, and then, but what about the baby? Quote, Natasha asked, amazed, what will he eat? Oh, don't worry about that. We have excellent formula. No one will starve your baby. But then, once your milk comes in, and I think it will take a few days at most, you'll be able to feed yourself. Quote. Having assured her that all this was safe for the baby, Alexei Vadimovich began asking her questions about her well-being. But after examining her, he wished her a speedy recovery. Soon, her husband reappeared in the room, wearing a happy mask that reeked of falsehood from a mile away. Oleg handed her a huge bouquet of red roses. He'd bought it with great reluctance, as he hadn't expected to receive a call from the hospital to tell him his wife had regained consciousness. What a tenacious old hag! He growled, adjusting the flowers in their festive packaging as he stood in the doorway. Congratulations, he exclaimed under his breath as he handed her the bouquet. Oh, God, I was so worried about you, so scared when the doctor said you might not survive the night. That was all Natasha could manage, but she said nothing more, though it was terribly unpleasant to watch this hypocrisy. Oleg hesitated for a moment next to her bed, and then, sitting down on a creaky chair, he tenderly took her hand, feigning genuine concern. Darling, I love you so much, Lon purred, and Natasha was forced to force a weak smile in response. I didn't want to upset you before you got better, but then again, you'll find out sooner or later anyway. Her husband pretended to look away, embarrassed. Natalia's heart began to beat faster. What happened? Oleg sighed heavily and looked at her intently. Your mother called a couple of hours ago and told me that your second cousin Susanna Igorovna had passed away. Oh my God, quote. Natasha felt her heart sink. She didn't really know this relative, and Susanna had emigrated to Israel almost 20 years ago. However, they occasionally corresponded with her mother, and she often told her about her relative's life abroad. The news was still very sad. I sympathize with you, her husband continued. But you know, your grandmother unexpectedly turned out to be unusually generous to you. And at that moment, a greedy expression flashed in Oleg's eyes. Then a triumphant smile spread across his face. Natalia felt as if she were talking not to her husband, but to a complete stranger. In what sense? She left you her entire fortune, Vrachova's husband said. And that's 30 million rubles plus some real estate. And besides, her husband paused briefly, then finished breathlessly. Shares in the country's largest agro-industrial holding. Can you imagine that? Yes, we'll be provided for several lifetimes to come. Quote. Natalia felt sick. Something told her Oleg had known about this inheritance for a long time. His words about it being unexpected were completely at odds with his reaction. It's strange that she decided to bequeath it to me, Natalia responded, looking closely at her husband. She probably had closer friends. Doesn't that seem odd? The expression on Oleg's face clearly indicated he was already mentally counting all the money owed to his wife under the will, but upon hearing her words, his eyes immediately assumed an innocent expression. Who knows? I can probably guess she wanted the money to go to someone truly close to her, not to the strangers she lived with. Natalia didn't quite believe his words. Of course, Oleg had learned about his great-aunt long before he overheard her phone conversation with his mother-in-law. Both women were talking on speakerphone, so Oleg heard everything perfectly. Realizing that, with luck, he could significantly improve his affairs, Oleg began keeping a close eye on the elderly woman. When he learned that her health was failing and she had no direct heirs, he realized his moment had arrived. His job allowed him to have some connections abroad. Sending his little man to an elderly relative, Oleg let her know that her cousin's granddaughter was going through a very difficult time in her life, and only her grandmother could help her. Having thus gathered Sasanya and asked her not to tell her mother, Natasha, saying she was ashamed, Oleg could only wait. He had worked for a long time in a law firm and was considered an excellent specialist. And that's precisely why he was confident that if his wife died, he would inherit everything without a problem. Natalia, meanwhile, continued her treatment. A couple of days later, her milk did indeed come in, and she was finally able to breastfeed independently. While doing this, she often wondered what to do now that she had come into a large inheritance. Clearly, she could no longer trust her own husband, so she tried to think of a way out. Meanwhile, Natalia began spending more and more time with Klavdia. The young nurse regularly cleaned their room, and they had become friends without noticing. Klava, as promised, called her mother, but when she arrived at the hospital, Natalia was afraid to tell her everything. She thought that by telling her about her husband's betrayal, she would unwittingly put her mother in danger. After all, anything could happen now. As she cradled tiny Pavlik in her arms, she noticed the nurse's gaze fixed on them. Klava was cleaning the room, but when she saw her baby in her arms, she froze. She had seen Natalia and other young mothers feeding or interacting with their babies before. But today, feminine envy was clearly visible in her eyes. Quiet tears streamed down her cheeks. Klav, what's wrong? Natasha looked at her in confusion. Did something happen? She sniffled and, quickly brushing the tears from her face, continued washing the floors. In response to her question, she merely shook her head sadly. Well, I look at you and think, how lucky you are. Becoming a mother is the greatest happiness of all. Single quote quote. Natalia hesitated, embarrassed, and replied, yes, I understand, but you know, it didn't just happen. It took a lot of fighting for it. I told you, remember? Quote. The nurse nodded, but said without looking, you're doing well. Fate itself gnawed away her baby, and I lost my fight. Quote. Klava put the bucket down and only then looked up at the confused Natalia. I had a miscarriage 2 months ago. She pushed the rag away with all her might, as if she had put all her emotions into it. And since then I can't have children. The doctor said something was damaged inside. Natasha sympathized with her, and then Klava carefully sat down next to her on the edge of the bed. Oh, Natasha, if you only knew how I dream of a baby. After all, when you have your own little one, the world immediately becomes brighter, and you don't need any husband nearby, even for nothing. Natalia looked at her sadly. Well, I still think you need a complete family, both a mother and a father. In response to this, Klava only snorted contemptuously. Well, yes, of course, my husband, you know how he was admitted when he found out about everything. He said he didn't need a big-mouthed woman. Can you imagine? Bitter tears glistened in the nurse's eyes again. He said he didn't sign up for second-class housing and left. Throw in the tact. Who did he leave for? Nothing at all. A month later, she brought back a test with 2 strips. Just as ordered, so to speak. Klavdia turned away, covered her face with her hands, and burst into tears. Trying to console her and support her, Natasha gave her her little son for a while. When Klava took Pasha in her arms, her face lit up with a beautiful and tender smile. What a cutie, she said, crying. My son or daughter should have been the same. The nurse began rocking Pavlik and almost stopped paying attention to Natalia, so it was with great difficulty that she managed to get the child back. Well, okay, you probably need to go to other wards, right? Natalia wanted to hint that it was time for her. Klava looked at her strangely in response, as if in a trance, took her bucket and mop and left the ward. Natalia herself was understanding, believing that the grief had overwhelmed the nurse too much. That night, Natalia asked the doctor to leave Pasha with her. She didn't want to part with her son for a second. Although Alexei Vadimovich doubted the wisdom of this, Natasha was still weak. And it would be better if she rested at night than jumped up at every cry of the baby. But she persuaded him so much that the doctor eventually gave in. By that time almost all the young mothers who had been in the ward with her had already been discharged home. So Natalia was the only permanent patient left there. After putting her son in a high cradle, Natalia went to bed with a light heart, and in the morning, when she woke up and reached for the child, she was surprised to find that Pasha was gone. Quote, "Did they prescribe any procedures for us?" she asked the nurse as soon as the latter came in to check on her. The young nurse's face instantly turned pale. As far as I know, there were no instructions. The young mother's heart sank and immediately began to pound. Natalia even clutched at the blood. The nurse immediately called the attending physician and brought a sedative. Quote, "Oleg, come to the maternity hospital right now," she screamed at her husband's corpse. "Our son has been stolen." What? He couldn't believe his ears. "Natasha, don't worry, I'll be there right now." Oleg shook his fist on the other end of the line, and Natalia, listening to him, understood only one thing. Her husband had nothing to do with the disappearance. Apparently, he was seriously scared himself. Quote, "Who was the last person you spoke to before the child disappeared?" The doctor asked her some time later. He had already checked all the discharge papers, but none of the mothers who had been with her had left the hospital with 2 children. Quote, "Not with anyone in particular," she answered after a pause. Her heart instantly went cold. Quote, Klava is a nurse. I let her hold Pasha for a bit, and a terrible guess flashed through her mind. And the doctor's face, which immediately turned gray, clearly indicated she was right. Why did you do that? The doctor clutched his head. Don't you know? Children should never be given into the hands of strangers. Only if they are your relatives or someone you truly trust. Quote. Natasha was frightened. After all, she really didn't know anything about Klava. They had only known each other for a few days. Calm down, you absolutely mustn't get nervous now, the doctor said decisively, calling a nurse to give her a sedative injection. It's my own fault, the doctor continued unexpectedly. He felt sorry for Klava. She was brought to our department right after a miscarriage. Her condition was very serious. We thought she'd never recover, but fortunately, she did. Alexei Vadimovich sighed heavily. And then we learned that Klava had a rather bad psychiatric diagnosis in her medical history. Natalia felt the room before her eyes begin to spin rapidly. She wasn't given a very good diagnosis. It seems like post-traumatic psychosis, the doctor added. The loss of a child and infertility. All this negatively affected her psyche, but we couldn't throw her out on the street. After all, her husband left her, so we took her in and allowed her to stay as a nurse. But you don't have to worry about your son's life and health, the doctor assured her. Klava is excellent with children. After all, she was so prepared to become a mother. So, most likely, this is simply an uncontrollable desire to have a child, and not a specific resentment towards you or the baby. Despite these reassurances, things weren't getting any easier. When my husband arrived, he started yelling at the entire staff at the top of his lungs. What's going on here? Who's stealing your children? They snatched them right from under their mother's nose. Is that even normal? When the doctor tried to explain, my husband almost attacked him. So you're telling me some sick nurse stole a child, and no one knows where she is? I'll sue you too. You'll spend the rest of your days in jail. Alexei Vadimovich tried to calm him down, but Oleg was beyond stopping. I don't care about your consolation. Call the police, declare an interception plan, and do something already. My husband's eyes were burning, but Natasha wasn't entirely sure whether this was genuine affection for her son or some kind of elaborate stunt. However, she didn't have long to ponder. Her hands and feet suddenly froze, and her heart began to pound so hard that the young mother, unable to bear the pain, lost consciousness. Quote. Quickly, the medications. Alexei Vadimovich shouted in panic. Oleg Stanislavovich, please leave the room. Your wife has gotten worse. A strange expression flashed across her husband's gaze, half surprise for Nadezhda. What's wrong with her? Hypertensive cross, he responded instantly, hooking Natalia up to a machine that monitored her blood pressure and heart rate. Your wife could go into a coma at any moment, he said. When he glanced at the visitor, he saw a barely perceptible smile tugging at the corners of his lips. With difficulty suppressing the urge to punch him, the doctor wheeled Natalia to the intensive care unit. Along the way, they were joined by a young doctor who had arrived from a neighboring region as part of a practice exchange program. Semyon Romanovich immediately grasped the situation and, after assessing the patient's overall condition, asked permission to personally perform resuscitation measures. Quote, I worked a lot in emergency care at my previous job, he explained. Every minute counts with this woman. If we make a mistake, we could lose her completely. The attending physician, after thinking for a few seconds, merely nodded silently. To his great surprise, Semyon carried out all the procedures in such a way that he not only brought Natalia out of a dangerous condition, but also prevented a whole series of complications. Quote, "You're something else," Semyon Romanovich, Alexei Vadimovich whistled with admiration. "It was worth sending you to us for a reason. That's what we think. We still have something to learn from you, and not the other way around." Semyon only nodded modestly and said that he would keep an eye on Natalia himself from now on. Fortunately, she regained consciousness fairly quickly. However, as soon as she saw the young doctor, she grabbed his sleeve with all her might. Quote, "Give me my son back, please." Natasha took a deep breath. Klava, the nurse, it was all her fault. "Listen, I don't know what happened to you," Semyon said cautiously. "But if you tell me, I'll try to help." Meanwhile, Oleg viewed the whole situation from his own perspective. Despite being the loudest voice in the room about his son's kidnapping, he decided not to report it to the police. He decided to look for it himself. And to do that, first and foremost, he needed to find the crazy nurse. Oleg's plan was simple. Take Pavlik from her, but not give him to his wife. Instead, hide him securely, so no one but him would know. He planned to tell Natalia that he hadn't succeeded, and that would surely drive his wife completely crazy. Having decided this, he set about executing his plan. He had some connections not only among private detectives who had previously worked for the law enforcement agencies, but also among criminal organizations. He managed to recruit several smart gangsters who agreed to help for a small commission. Less than a week later, Oleg was on the trail. The nurse was hiding with distant relatives at a dacha located in a gardening community in the region. Upon learning of this, he and his assistants arrived and practically kicked down the door to the small house. Upon entering, Oleg immediately heard a child's cry and, rushing to the living room, saw a terrified Klavdia. Her little son was crying in her arms. Quote, "What, did you think you could outwit me?" Oleg said, glaring at her with hatred. "You got your son back quickly." Oleg began to advance threateningly, while his accomplices eloquently stretched their necks and cracked their knuckles. "No, what are you doing? You're mistaken," she screamed. "I don't know, this is my son, Vidya." The young woman's gaze was filled with madness and fear, so Alec realized quickly. Hesitation could cost him his most precious time. Klava darted sharply to the right, running down the narrow corridor that led to the kitchen. She was planning to escape through the back door. However, she was already being watched there. Quote, "Wait a minute, citizen, let's calmly return the child, and we won't call the police." Caught off guard, Klavdia burst into tears and was forced to hand Pasha over to his legal father, but he glared angrily at the nurse. "Pray I'm kind today," she said, or else the man pretended to swing his arm, but actually adjusted his hair. Klavdia burned into a ball. Grinning like a shark, Oleg said, "We'll do this. You run as far away from the city as possible and you'll sit as quiet as a mouse, so she doesn't even think of uttering a peep about who you gave the child to and when. Is that clear to you?" Klava sobbed pitifully. "And if you decide to tell the police anything? You'll only have yourself to blame. You'll end up in a mental hospital, just like my wife." Giving her a final dark look, he got into the car and drove away. "I'm afraid we need to accept this situation and say goodbye to our son," Oleg told his wife a little later, having arrived at the hospital. Quote, "What are you talking about?" She couldn't believe her ears. "You reported it to the police. Are they already looking for Pavlik?" Her husband simply sighed deeply and, looking up, said, "Of course they are, but you understand, this Klavdia, she's absolutely insane." It was hard to accept, but she could do anything to the child. Natasha felt her heart being squeezed again in a steel vice. No, Alexei Vadimovich said she was simply grieving over her loss. But she posed no danger to the child. Quote, "And you believed him?" Oleg raised his eyebrows skeptically. "It's just to calm you down, and to shield the hospital." Natalia looked at the mush and began to toss and turn, sobbing hysterically. "Just what I need," he chuckled to himself. "Cry, it might get worse." Satisfied, he drove from the hospital straight to the rented apartment where his newborn son was staying at that very moment. He was under the round-the-clock care of a specially hired nanny and governess. Oleg did everything he could to ensure the child wanted for nothing. Quote, "Well, Pash?" Shaking a rattle in front of the baby's nose, the father said with a smile. "Soon we'll be rich as kings. We just have to wait." Tiny Pasha, uncomprehending, just stared with his small, naive eyes. For the rest of her stay in the maternity hospital, Natalia felt like she was in prison. Although she had recovered physically, she was a complete wreck mentally. She grieved for her missing son and simply didn't have the strength for anything other than the mandatory procedures and medication. By the time she was discharged, the young woman literally couldn't stand on her own 2 feet, so much so that she had to use a wheelchair to get to her husband's car. Oleg wasn't exactly jubilant on the inside, but outwardly he feigned grief. But as soon as Natalia turned away and the doctors looked the other way, his face took on a slightly arrogant expression. As she got into the car, Natasha clutched the small piece of paper on which Semyon Romanovich had left his phone number. Quote, "If you suddenly feel ill or realize you can't cope, don't hesitate to call me. I see you may need help. And it turns out you don't trust your husband." And that was the honest truth. She couldn't trust anyone anymore. Her husband was hiding something and clearly wished her ill, but she didn't know why. On the other hand, having barely found a friend, she immediately lost her. After all, Klava had betrayed her so vilely. And only the young doctor remained with any trust. Semyon was the only one who didn't try to calm her down or convince her to let things go. No, he simply offered to help. When Oleg brought her home, the first thing she wanted to do was scream loudly and wildly. She couldn't calmly walk past the brand new nursery, which they had specially furnished before she went to the hospital. Quote, "Why didn't you clean anything up?" she asked her husband, almost screaming. "You knew it hurt." She looked into his eyes, but saw only emptiness there. Oleg smiled awkwardly. Quote, "Sorry, honey, I got carried away. These searches are at work, projects, I'll fix everything." Natalia couldn't say for sure, but at some point it seemed to her that her husband had left the nursery open in that state on purpose. God, it seems that way. Now I'll go to the crib, and he'll be lying there. You can't imagine how hard this is. Natalia shook her head and went to the bedroom, where she locked herself in to drown her sorrows. Oleg, meanwhile, was rubbing his hands contentedly. It seemed the plan would work faster than he expected. After all, with each passing day, his wife was sinking deeper into depression. The only thing he didn't realize was that Semyon had begun following him. The young doctor suspected something was wrong when he saw Oleg's true face one day. And at that moment, he realized that Natalia was wary of her husband for a reason. For several days, the young doctor diligently followed, even taking a short leave of absence from work. He followed Oleg closely, and in the end, he even followed him to the very house and apartment where Natalia's cunning husband kept his young son. To achieve this, Semyon had to pretend to be a courier and, under the pretext of delivering something, sneak into the entrance. Hearing a child's cry from the apartment Oleg had just entered, Semyon immediately understood everything. By nature, he was an honest and very brave man. Therefore, he was not afraid to tell the police about it, but first he wanted to talk to Natalia about it, so Semyon immediately hurried to the car, but did not take into account that Oleg had posted security next to the house. The criminals grabbed the doctor as he approached the car and immediately dragged him into the nearest gateway. Quote, "We immediately copied you. Grin," said one of the bandits. "You look dressed like a courier, but the number on your box is fake. I already checked everything." Quote, "You know what? The police won't leave you that easily," Semyon responded boldly. "Your client apparently doesn't know that kidnapping children is a criminal offense, and the sentence is substantial." The second thug grabbed him by the collar of his jacket and kicked him hard in the stomach. "Are you crazy or something? He's his father." "Shut up," the first thug warned his accomplice. However, he immediately heard the quiet laughter of Semyon, who had doubled over. "It's too late. I've already recorded everything and sent it to the cloud storage. You and your Oleg are going to get some serious time." Enraged, they began beating the doctor, using their fists and a steel pipe they found right there in the alley. When they finished their dirty work, Semyon lay on the pavement with a fractured skull. He showed no obvious signs of life. Realizing they'd overdone it a bit, the thugs fled, but little did they know that an elderly homeless man, cowering in fear behind the trash cans, had witnessed the incident. A man approached the lifeless Semyon and, using his own phone, called an ambulance. This was the only thing that saved the unfortunate surgeon's life. He soon ended up in intensive care. At first, local doctors were wary of making any prognosis. But fortunately, Semyon eventually regained consciousness. However, he couldn't describe what he had seen. He had almost completely lost his memory. The only thing he could remember was getting behind the wheel that morning. But where was he going? Why, Semyon couldn't say. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, the unfortunate Natalia was desperately trying to find any clues. She wanted to find Klava. She felt her son was alive, and the nurse seemed to be the only one who could tell her the truth. The young woman scoured social media, trying to find any news reports, but all was in vain. To make matters worse, Oleg continued to add fuel to the fire, deliberately causing her to suffer. Quote, "Natasha, that's enough already," her husband said, rolling his eyes dramatically. "My son is gone. He might still be alive, but he's living with Klava somewhere in the north. How can you be so heartless?" She wondered. "Your child has disappeared, and you've stopped searching and are just moving on with your life." Shaking her head, she went into another room. She didn't want to talk to him anymore. Oleg, meanwhile, began staying late at work, leaving Natalia to cope with her own grief. And all because he'd realized long ago that despair and loneliness would naturally accelerate the onset of psychosis, and then he'd calmly send her to a mental hospital. And all this time, he'd skillfully hidden his mistress. Natalia had no idea, and yet it was Karina who gave him the idea about the inheritance. Quote, "I'll see you in a month in our brand new cozy apartment," she cooed to Oleg over the phone yet again. "And I really hope that by then you'll already be an eligible bachelor." Oleg. He couldn't wait for his wife to finally break down. One day, left home alone, Natalia realized she was ready to climb the walls with boredom. Deciding to take a walk, she didn't even notice how her feet carried her to the embankment. It was quite early, and there were practically no people in sight. Natasha looked at the water's surface glistening in the morning light and thought about her son. What had happened to him? Where was he? And would they ever see each other again? Despair rose within her like a powerful wave, and the woman took a few steps towards the water. There were no specific thoughts in her head, but the dark surface was so pleasantly beckoning. A few moments later, she found herself at the very edge. "Natasha, don't!" A familiar voice cried out behind her, and someone abruptly grabbed her arm. Klava. Her amazement knew no bounds. The runaway nurse stood before her, completely broken. She had lost a lot of weight during this time, and pure fear splashed in her eyes. "Forgive me, Natasha," Claudia collapsed on her knees before her. "I don't know what came over me. I would never have harmed Pasha. It was beyond me." Quote. Claudia choked on tears, and Natalie, finally coming to her senses, pounced on her as if she were a mother bear who had lost her cub. "Where is he?" she growled, grabbing the former nurse by the collar of her jacket. "Where have you put my son?" Natalia couldn't contain herself any longer. All her pain, all her torment and uncertainty poured out in a powerful stream of rage. "How could you even think of such a thing? I've regretted it 100 times already," Klava justified herself to her. "When your husband's people came to me, I thought it was time to say goodbye to life." And at that moment, Natalia seemed to freeze. "What did you say, my husband's people?" Klavdi slowly rose to her feet and wiped away her tears. "So isn't Pavlik with you again now?" "I thought Oleg brought him home a long time ago." Quote. Natalia shook her head very slowly and instantly turned pale. "Don't you remember what they talked about?" Natasha asked her quickly. Perhaps they mentioned certain places on the street, but Klavdi only shrugged sadly. And then she remembered something. "And he said, if I tell the police everything, I'll end up in a mental hospital, just like you soon." Something clicked in Natalia's head. The picture seemed to come together. He needed the child so he could become his legal guardian until he came of age and manage all the money. Well, of course, Oleg was after the inheritance. Not believing she'd let him fool her so easily, Natalia rushed home without even saying goodbye. She tried calling Semyon. She wanted to share the news, ask for help, but he didn't answer. From that day on, she began following her husband, realizing he was hiding Pasha in another apartment, probably a rented one, and soon she found that very house. She even managed to catch a glimpse of her son when the nanny was walking him in the yard. More than anything else, she wanted to rush to her and snatch her child away, but she knew that if she did so, she would risk losing everything. Her husband would probably hide the child somewhere else and lock her up in a mental hospital. After taking photos of her son and the nanny on her phone, as well as pictures of the house, Natalia, without wasting a minute, went to the police. However, at first, none of the investigators took her seriously. "You're kidding me, citizen," an elderly policeman told her. "This is such a stupid story. How can a father find his own son and then claim he disappeared? Absurd. And besides, if, as you say, your child was stolen long ago, why didn't you report it to the police?" "Because I was lying in the hospital, dying," Natalia answered, sobbing. "And he said that he went to you and even conducted a search, but it was fruitless." The investigator thought for a moment, but then still refused to accept the statement. Upset to the limit, she was about to leave the station when she was suddenly stopped by a young intern from the neighboring department. "Forgive my colleague," he apologized. "I heard everything you told me, and I believe you. You say a relative left a large inheritance. From now on, you can tell me more." Not believing her luck, Natalia smiled happily through her tears and told everything. She also included photographs. The young investigator did not let the case slide, but, having gathered the same young and energetic colleagues, detained Oleg hot on the trail. Despite his resistance and attempts to make his wife look crazy, the police checked him thoroughly, finding not only little Pavlik, but also a whole series of Oleg managed to pull off a scam. While he was working at a legal firm, Natasha was returned to her son, and she was somewhat over the moon at the time. Pasha, it turned out, hadn't yet had time to properly adjust to formula, so he happily switched to his mother's milk. Natalia forgave Klavdia, and now she came to visit them almost every day. She tried to make amends, helped, and enjoyed any opportunity to spend time with the baby. During their time on the run, Klava had become very attached to the child and was happy when Natasha later allowed her to be his godmother. Semyon recovered some time later and remembered everything that happened on that fateful day. Trying to help Natasha, he wanted to go home to download the file from the cloud and give it to the police. However, the young mother herself came to his room with Pasha in her arms. Seeing the young doctor's shock, she explained that when she couldn't get through, she initially thought that he was just busy. However, the further she went, the more anxiety grew in her heart. And in the end, she went to the maternity hospital to ask where Semyon was. "That's how I found out what happened to you," she said with a sad smile. "And we were found. We're fine." Semyon was happy to hear such news. After showing her the recording made in the alley, they decided it would be another excellent piece of evidence to ensure Oleg received everything he was owed. And as soon as he was convicted, Natalia immediately filed for divorce. She no longer wanted to be associated with this vile man. Pasha, of course, stayed with her, and 6 months later Natalia married Semyon. After the due date, she received an inheritance, which she decided to invest in developing her own business, opening a maternity store and also selling products for newborns. Claudia actively helped her with this. The former nurse was the senior salesperson. Well, Natalia herself oversaw purchases and kept all the financial records. They became true friends and forgot all the past discord. Well, Claudia was able to finally recover from her mental illness. And she also found happiness in the person of that very same police trainee. If you like the story, please support me with a thumbs up. One simple action, but it means a lot to me. All the best.